All right, let's see if we can get it this time. Should have one there. Oh yeah, I got a really good coal. So again, I left the spindle in. I was pretty confident that I had a coal, but I wanted to make sure. So that worked good. Well, changing the density of the fireboard helped polish off the spindle. And even though the spindle ended up being larger than I wanted it to be because the part that I carved away kind of burned off, it worked. So I had a yucca spindle cedar fireboard. That was a good combination because I had a softer, more fibrous spindle. So I had to go with a harder fireboard. Of how to use a larger spindle. Like this spindle is really way too long for this amount of weight, and I actually weighed this one and it's just over a pound, so it's 1.2 pounds for this log, which was pretty close to the stone that I used, which was 1.4, so almost a pound and a half, but this one is almost a pound and a quarter, so 1.2. But it's too large to fit down on here, and I don't want a spindle this big around, so that's almost the size of my thumb. I want it to be about the size of my pinky. So I'm gonna carve and try to get the weight to right around here. So that means I'm gonna have to carve this down, but then I'm gonna leave this for 4 or 5 inches. I'm going to leave this the normal width and then carve down this last little piece. So if you didn't have enough cordage to be able to carve the cordage, and that's also what I'm finding is by carving into that already small spindle that's about the size of my pinky, it creates a weakness. So as that spins, it tends to break right around where I carved. This will prevent that because it'll keep that thickness and won't weaken the spindle. And won't waste extra cordage. Here's the method of using a larger spindle. So you notice I tapered the end down here to the size that I wanted, just a little bit smaller than my pinky. This one is not quite as thick as my thumb, but it's still too wide to use the way I want with this weight. So I want to taper that end down. The easiest way to do this, because you're going to have to come down the length of the spindle, is to slide the spindle on, and when it gets to a sticking point, carve right in front of it just a couple inches and then slide it down. That way you don't take away too much. And so you can see I was doing that along the way. You notice here I didn't take any off because it was able to slide over, but everywhere it got stuck I would pull it back up and then carve that area down, and then that allows you to prevent taking too much off the spindle, and that'll work really well. Now I won't have to tie this down. It won't be required to tie it down. I can if it starts to slip, but it should be stuck on there pretty well without having to tie around it. So that'll save me some cordage there. So that is one advantage of this method, is that there's so much width of this weight, and because I used a larger spindle, it's kind of stuck in place. Now if I notice it starts to slip, I'll bang it down a little bit further and that should lock it in, but if it still doesn't, then I could use some cordage to lock it into place. So now I'm going to put the handle on and we're going to try it out before we waste it. Yeah, that is not a very good spindle. So this is what I was talking about on density of spindles and fireboards. See how fibrous that is and how fibrous and light colored that powder is? That means this spindle may not work. I actually may try a cedar and see if I can get it to work there, because it'll be a greater density. That I just described will work for a bow drill, for a hand drill, for a pump drill, for a pull drill, anything with a spindle and a fireboard where your spindle's burning through too quick. That could be due to the thickness of the spindle, could be due to how much downward pressure you're giving. But another thing to check is how soft is your fireboard, how soft is a spindle, which one can you change out the easiest. Obviously I couldn't change out the spindle here because my whole setup was designed around it. I mean, I could, but it would take longer. The easier thing to change was the fireboard. So instead of going with the yucca fireboard, I switched to a cedar fireboard. Okay, so that worked good. We went with, because we had a softer spindle, we realized it was not working out well. You can look at that dust. You see how it never did brown, and it was really fibrous. Most of that was coming from the spindle. So I carved it down, and it was burning through this fireboard, this yucca fireboard, way too fast. And I wasn't getting the black dust that I needed, so I switched, because the spindle was soft, I switched to a harder fireboard, which I used cedar. And that worked good, because it polished it off, but it still retained enough friction to burn up this dust. Plus the dust that was coming out, you see these big chunks here? You don't want that. You want to make sure that it is nice and powdery. And it's not saying that that won't work, but that's an indication that your spindle's boring through your fireboard because the fireboard's too soft, or that the spindle's too soft and it's just dissolving into the fireboard. And I think I was having a combination of the two. Switched to a harder fireboard. Even though the spindle was super soft and fibrous, it was enough to kind of powder up the fibers that were coming off so that they would fill the notch, and they were turning brown at first, so that was a good indication. Then they started to turn black, and that's an even better indication that you're about to get a coal. And you could see the smoke just rolling around the spindle, so it wasn't getting stuck in the fireboard. Even though I had a shorter line, instead of having 12 inches, I only had 11 inches of line of travel. That still worked because I was able to get a lot of RPMs. And this weight is 1.1 pounds for that size of spindle. So that worked pretty well. I was actually, the part of the spindle that I carved down smaller actually burned away first and created the powder. And so I was able to use this larger spindle for this pump drill, and I didn't have to use cordage to keep the weight in place because I carved down the spindle so that I could fit it and it would get stuck on the spindle itself. So that's good. That's a good combination.